$2. That was what she laid on the counter of the auction shed. 2 crumpled bills smoothed flat against the wood, and the man behind the ledger looked at them the way a person looks at a joke told badly at a funeral. Behind her, in the back pen where nobody bothered to walk, 40 ewes stood packed against the rails with their heads low and their ribs showing through wool that hung off them in gray ropes, matted, burr-tangled, stinking of neglect. Somebody had run them hard and fed them nothing, and when the bidding on the good stock finished, these were the leftovers, the ones the callers gave up on, and the auctioneer had said, half laughing, that he'd take anything for the lot just to be shut of them. So a girl not yet 23 had stepped up out of the folding chairs, and she had said $2, and she had meant it, and now she was standing there while the whole shed decided what kind of fool she was. Her name was Della Corwin, and she did not blink when the men laughed. She had looked at those ewes for a long time before she raised her hand. That was a thing people would remember about her later, the looking. She had walked the back rail slow while the sale went on without her, and she had crouched and put her fingers into the filthy fleece of one old mother sheep, down past the dirt and the tangle to where the fiber lay close against the skin, and she had held it there a while, rubbing it slow between thumb and finger like a woman testing cloth she meant to buy a bolt of. Then she had stood up and wiped her hand on her jeans and said nothing to anyone, and waited for the leftovers to come up and bought them for the price of a soda pop. If you're the kind of person who has ever been told that the thing you have, or the thing you are, isn't worth the trouble, do me a favor before we go on. Tap that like button and tell me down in the comments what town you're watching from, because I read them, all of them, and I like knowing where these stories land. Now let me take you back to that shed, and to the man who said the thing that this whole story spent 2 years proving wrong. His name was Roy Tesler, and he ran the biggest place in that end of the valley, 400 acres of good bottomland along the Scarrow Creek Road, and he had opinions the way other men have pocket change, always a fistful ready. He was leaning on the outside rail when Della came out with a receipt for 40 ewes, and a look on her face like she'd bought something worth having, and he tipped his cap back and said, loud enough for the men around him, that she'd just paid $2 for 40 funerals. "Sheep like that don't come back," he said. "You put good feed into a broke ewe, and all you get is a dead ewe with your money in her belly. She'll be burying that flock inside a month," he told the others, "and the vet bill cost her more than the whole outfit's worth, and that's if the dogs and the weather don't get there first. Wool's dead in this valley anyway," he said. "Nobody's paid a fair price for a fleece in 30 years. That ground her grandpa left her's good for cattle and nothing else, and she's out here buying rejects like she knows a secret the rest of us don't." He said it kindly, almost, the way conventional wisdom is always kind to itself, and the men nodded, because every word of it was the ordinary truth as they understood it, and Della, loading her ewes into a borrowed stock trailer one careful head at a time, heard every word and answered none of them. The place she was hauling them back to sat at the dead end of Muldoon Hollow, in a fold of the hills where the county road turned to gravel and then to grass, in a stretch of eastern Ohio hill country that had gone quiet the way a lot of those hollows had gone quiet, farm by farm, as the young people left and the old people died, and the barns leaned into the weather until they lay down. Her grandfather Alden Corwin had kept sheep there his whole life, back when there'd been a woolen mill down in Barrow Falls, and a reason to keep them. And after the mill closed, he'd kept them anyway, stubborn, running a small flock of a breed nobody else in the county bothered with. And when he died the winter Della turned 21, he'd left her the place and everything on it, and a shed full of things nobody thought were worth anything. She had come back to the hollow not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that felt like it was asking her to stay. She had a job in the city that she'd walked away from, and an apartment she'd let go, and a car that barely made the grade up the hollow road. And she had her grandfather's house, cold and half empty, and his notebooks, and his old dog, and his one living relative besides herself, which was his sister, her great-aunt Verna, who lived in the small house at the near end of the property and had buried 2 husbands and outlasted most everyone she'd ever argued with. Verna Corwin was 86 that year and moved like weather, slow and certain, and she wore her dead husband's canvas coat and rubber boots to the barn without any self-consciousness about it, because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm. She spoke about as often as the creek froze, which in that hollow was rare, and when she did speak it was in short pieces you could carry in your pocket. It was Verna who had come out to the yard the evening Della backed the trailer up to the old sheep barn, and it was Verna who had stood there in the failing light watching the 40 sorry ewes stumble down the ramp, and Della had braced herself for the same verdict she'd gotten at the sale: funerals, foolishness, money in a dead ewe's belly. But Verna had not said any of that. She had watched the last ewe come down, the old broad one with the worst of the matting, and she had looked at the fleece the way Della had looked at it in the pen, and she had said only, "Your grandpa had that same blood in his flock." Then she had turned and walked back toward her house, and over her shoulder, almost as an afterthought, she had said the thing that Della would come back to 100 times over the next 2 years. Della had asked her what she meant, what blood, and Verna had stopped at the edge of the light and said, "The ones that hold their coat through a bad winter are the ones worth keeping." Then she was gone into the dark, and Della stood there with 40 starving sheep and no idea yet what her great-aunt had just handed her. That first night she did not sleep much. She sat at her grandfather's kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold and one of his notebooks open in front of her, and she read his cramped pencil handwriting by the light of the one bulb that still worked over the sink. Alden Corwin had kept records the way some men keep faith, quietly and without expecting reward, and the notebooks went back decades, weights and lambing dates and weather notes, and scattered through all of it, remarks about individual sheep the way you'd write about people you knew. There was a line she found that first night that stopped her, written in a hand gone shaky with the year he must have written it, and it said, "The fine ones are always the ugly ones out of the pen. Folks judge a sheep by the outside of the fleece, and the outside is the part that lies." She read that 3 times. Outside on the yard the ewes were coughing and shifting in the strange barn, and somewhere among them was the old broad ewe whose coat had felt, under all that filth, like something she'd never touched before. And Della closed the notebook and decided she would find out whether her grandfather and her great-aunt were right or whether Roy Tesler was, and she would find it out the slow way, because there wasn't any fast way, and because slow was the only speed the hollow had ever known. The work that came next was not the kind of work that makes a story, which is to say it was the only kind that makes a life. She wormed them and she trimmed their feet, and she fed them by hand out of a budget so thin it squeaked, buying culled hay off a neighbor and hauling water in the cold before dawn. And she lost 3 of them in the first 2 weeks, exactly as Roy had predicted, 3 that were too far gone to pull back, and she buried them at the edge of the woods herself with a borrowed post-hole digger and did not tell anyone. And she wrote their ear-tag numbers in the notebook with the dates, because her grandfather had taught her through his pages that you write down the losses too, or you learn nothing. But 37 of them held. 37 of them lifted their heads by the 3rd week and started to look like sheep again instead of like the idea of sheep, and their coughs eased and their eyes cleared, and the fear went out of the way they moved when she came into the barn. She spent hours in there just being present, sitting on an overturned bucket while they got used to her. And she watched them the way she'd learned to watch things patiently, without needing them to hurry, and she began to notice what Verna had meant about the coat. Because it was February by then, and February in Muldoon Hollow was a serious month, and there came a night that first winter when the temperature fell out of the sky, and the wind came down the hollow like it had somewhere to be. Della went out at midnight with a flashlight, afraid she'd find sheep frozen against the fence, and instead she found them lying easy in the straw, warm, dry, the cold beating on the surface of their fleece and rolling off, and when she put her hand down against the old broad ew's side, Down through the wet outer coat, she found the wool underneath bone dry and warm as an oven, and she understood in that moment something that a page of her grandfather's writing had been trying to tell her. This breed carried two coats. There was a long, coarse outer layer that shed the weather like a roof sheds rain, and beneath it, close against the skin, a dense, fine undercoat, soft past anything she'd felt, that held the heat in and let the wet run off. And it was this doubled structure, this ugly weatherproof armor, that made the fleece look like garbage from the outside and made the sheep worthless to every buyer who judged by the outside. Folks judge a sheep by the outside of the fleece, her grandfather had written, and the outside is the part that lies. Della sat in that barn at 1 in the morning with her hand buried in warm, dry wool, while the worst of the winter howled 6 inches away on the other side of the wall, and she started quietly to understand what she had bought for $2. She did not tell anyone. That was the first small proof, and she kept it to herself the way you keep an ember, cupped in your hands, because there was a long distance between knowing a thing and being able to show it, and she meant to close that distance before she said a word to Roy Tesler or anyone like him. She read every notebook her grandfather had left, all of them, some nights until the coffee stopped working and she fell asleep in the chair, and she pieced together from his scattered pencil remarks the outline of a knowledge that had died with the woolen mill and never gotten written down anywhere but in one old man's private pages. He had known what the fleece was worth. He had known there were people somewhere who would pay for wool like this, wool that could be spun into the warmest and most water-shedding of garments, wool that the industrial mills had rejected because their machines couldn't handle the double coat, and so the whole breed had been declared trash by an industry built to process the easy thing. Alden Corwin had kept them anyway, out of stubbornness and out of something like loyalty. And he had never made a dime off them, because he was a man who could see the worth of a thing, but had never learned the second, harder art, which was showing that worth to somebody else. Della had the notebooks, and she had the sheep, and she had, it turned out, the second art in her too, though she didn't know it yet, and she had all the time in the world, because she had no money, and time is what you have when you have nothing else. Spring came slow to the hollow that year, in a grudging thaw that turned the barnyard to a lake of mud. And with the warmth, the ewes began to lift and thicken, and Della learned that most of them were bred, which she hadn't dared hope, and through April and into May they lambed one by one in the small hours as sheep will, and she was there for nearly all of it because she'd taught herself to sleep light through her grandfather's pages. Of the 37 ewes, 31 lambed and raised living lambs, 34 lambs in all, counting the twins. And every one of those lambs came out of the womb wearing the beginnings of that same doubled coat, coarse and ugly on the outside and secretly, wonderfully fine beneath. And Della wrote every birth in the notebook the way her grandfather had, weight and date and dam, continuing his pages in her own hand, so that the two handwritings ran together across the years, like a conversation between the living and the dead. Verna came up sometimes and stood at the fence and watched the lambs, and once she said, without being asked anything, that Alden used to say a lamb out of a hardy ewe was worth 2 out of a soft one, and Della wrote that down too. By June, she had a flock of better than 70 head, and she had sheared the adults for the first time, and she had 30-some fleeces stacked in the clean end of the barn, and no earthly idea what to do with them. The shearing itself had been a comedy she'd have been embarrassed for anyone to watch, a girl who'd never held the clippers before wrestling ewes across a plywood floor, and coming away scratched and cursing. And it had taken her the better part of a week to do what a professional would have done in an afternoon. But she'd gotten it done. And when she skirted the fleeces on a makeshift table built of pallets, pulling away the filthy edges and laying out the good wool, she'd seen what she had. Under the weathered outer wool, the undercoat came away in clouds, soft past believing, longer in the staple than anything she'd read the industrial breeds produced, and she'd stood there in the barn holding a double handful of it up to the light from the open door and known, with a certainty that had no proof behind it yet, that this was worth something to somebody. She'd taken a fleece down to the gas station at the mouth of the hollow, where the county road met the state route, because the gas station was where the valley did its talking, and she'd shown it to the woman who ran the register, a sharp-eyed talker named Junie Holbrook, who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. And Junie had rubbed the wool between her fingers and said, "Well, I'll be, that's soft as a rabbit. Where'd you get sheep grow wool like that?" And Della had said, "Up the hollow." And Junie had said, "Your grandpa's crazy sheep." And Della had said, "Yes." And that was the first seed, though neither of them knew it. Because Junie Holbrook talked, and talking was the whole engine of what came after, and it started small the way the true things do. Junie mentioned the soft wool to a woman who came through for gas on her way to the artists' market they held on Saturdays down in Barrow Falls, and that woman turned out to spin, and she drove up the hollow the following week, easing her little car up the gravel that had defeated better vehicles, and she found Della in the barn and asked if she might buy a fleece to try. Her name was Marisol Deng, and she had moved out to the country from somewhere with more sidewalks, and she spun and knit and sold her work at the market, and she paid Della $40 for one raw fleece, which was the first money the Corwin sheep had ever made in their lives, more than her grandfather had earned off the whole breed across all his years of keeping them, and Della did not make a ceremony of it. She wrote it in the notebook, one fleece, $40, and the buyer's name. And she watched Marisol drive back down the hollow with the wool in her back seat, and felt the strange, quiet turning of a thing that had been going one direction for 30 years beginning, just barely, to go the other. Marisol Deng washed that fleece and spun it, and what came off her wheel stopped her cold, because the yarn had a loft and a warmth and a faint water-shedding character that she had never gotten out of any wool she'd bought, and she knitted a hat from it and wore it to the Saturday market in Barrow Falls, and 3 people asked her where the yarn came from before noon. She sold the hat for more than she'd ever sold a hat for, and she drove back up the hollow the next week and bought 4 more fleeces and asked Della, half joking, whether she could grow her some in colors. And Della, who by then had been through enough of her grandfather's notebooks to know the answer, said that some of the ewes threw silver and some threw a brown, so dark it was nearly black, and one old line threw a true charcoal, all of it natural, no dye. And Marisol Deng looked at Della the way you look at somebody who has just told you where a spring is in a dry country. Word moved from the market outward the way water finds the low ground. A weaver 2 counties over heard about the wool and called. A woman who made felted work heard about it from the weaver. By the end of that first summer, Della had sold every fleece she'd sheared and had a short list of people asking after the next clip, and she had raised her price twice, not out of greed, but because she kept selling out, and the notebook pages were filling with names. None of it was fast, and none of it was loud, and that was exactly why the men at the feed store in Barrow Falls did not believe it. Della went in every few weeks for supplies, and she overheard what they said, and mostly what they said was that a few city women buying wool for handicrafts was not a business, it was a hobby that hadn't figured out yet it was going to fail. Roy Tesler said it plainest, the way he said most things, one afternoon when Della was at the counter and he was by the door with 2 other landowners, and he said it not quite to her, but not quite away from her, the way a man does when he wants a thing heard. "That's the trouble with the young ones now," he said. "They think you can build something out of nothing if you just want it hard enough. Selling wool by the fleece to a handful of hobby spinners, that's not a living. That leads nowhere," he said. "You can't feed a flock through a winter on what a knitter pays for a bag of fluff. She'll play at it another year," he said, "and then she'll sell that ground to somebody who'll run cattle on it like God intended, and it'll be the best thing that ever happened to her." He offered it as a fact for her consideration, the way he offered everything. And Della paid for her feed and carried it out to her truck and did not argue, because she had learned from Verna and from her grandfather's pages that you do not win these arguments with words, you win them with the winner, and the winner was still 18 months from proving anything. She built through that second year the only way she knew, which was slow and small and out of her own pocket, refusing the one thing everyone with advice kept pressing on her, which was to borrow money and buy more sheep and scale the thing up fast before the moment passed. The banker down in Barrow Falls would have lent her a little on the strength of the ground, and Marisol Deng knew a woman who ran a fiber cooperative who talked about grants and expansion and a bigger flock, and even Junie Hallbrook at the gas station, who had adopted Della's success as partly her own doing and was not entirely wrong, thought she ought to be moving faster than she was. But Della had read her grandfather's notebooks front to back by then, twice, and she'd found in the last one, in the pages near his death, a stretch of writing about a bad year in the 70s when he'd let a feed dealer talk him into doubling the flock on credit and had nearly lost the whole place when the wool market fell. And beneath that account, he had written a line she copied onto the first page of her own notebook where she'd see it every day. Grow the flock the size the grass allows and no bigger, he'd written, and let the buyers pull you along, never the bank. So she let the buyers pull. She kept only the best of her ewe lambs each year, the ones whose coats came in the finest and shed the weather the cleanest, and she culled the rest without sentiment, and the flock grew the size the grass allowed and no bigger, and every fleece was spoken for before the shears touched it. The winters were the proof, and she came to understand that, and to almost welcome the hard ones. The second winter in the hollow brought an ice storm in January that took the power down for 9 days across the whole county and killed livestock on farms all up and down the valley, cattle that stood out in it and went down and didn't get up. And Roy Tesler lost 11 head of good stock that week, and it was the talk of the feed store for a month. Della's flock came through it without a single loss. She'd brought the ewes into the barn out of habit and out of her grandfather's teaching, but the truth was they hadn't needed it. And she knew because she'd gone out in the worst of the ice to check and found the young stock she'd left in the far pasture. The yearlings, standing in the open with a half-inch of ice built up on the outside of their fleeces, and every one of them warm and dry against the skin beneath, chewing their cud like the weather was somebody else's problem. She stood out there in the killing cold, with her hand pushed down through the icy armor into the dry, warm undercoat, and she thought about Verna's line, the ones that hold their coat through a bad winter are the ones worth keeping. And she understood at last that her great-aunt hadn't been talking about how to pick a sheep. She'd been telling her what the sheep were for. Marisol Deng had by then become something more than a customer, a friend, and a kind of translator, because she moved in the world of makers and markets that Della had no natural access to. And it was Marisol who carried the wool the next distance out, into the small circle of designers and knitters and weavers for whom the word rare was not a marketing trick, but a real and hungry condition. She took Della's silver and charcoal and near black fleeces to a fiber festival 3 states east that fall on her own initiative, without telling Della until it was done, and she came back with something Della had not expected, which was reputation. People at that festival, people who spun wool for a living and knew every breed and every fiber, had held the Corwin wool and asked where it came from and written the name down, Muldoon Hollow, Corwin flock, and one of them, a woman who designed patterns that thousands of people knit from, had bought enough to make a sample garment and had put it in a magazine that fall with a note about the extraordinary weatherproof wool from a rediscovered Ohio flock. And after that the letters and the calls did not stop. Della raised her prices again. She was selling raw fleece now for more than her grandfather had gotten for a whole year's clip of it in his best year. And she still could not keep up with what people wanted, and she still had not spent $1 she didn't have, and the notebook was on its 3rd volume, her handwriting now filling pages her grandfather never lived to fill. It was around then, deep in that second winter, with the ice barely melted off the north slopes, that Verna's health began to slip, and Della started spending her evenings down at the small house at the near end of the property, sitting with her great-aunt through the long, dark hours. And it was in those evenings that the old woman gave her the last of what she had to give. Verna was not a woman who explained herself, but as her strength went, she grew a little more willing to talk, and she told Della things about Alden that the notebooks didn't hold, how he'd started keeping the double-coated breed against everybody's advice back when they were dirt cheap and considered a nuisance, how a wool buyer had once laughed him out of an office in the city, how he'd kept them anyway all those unprofitable years, because, Verna said, he could not stand to be the one who let a good thing die just because the world had gotten too clever to see it. He was right about the sheep, Verna said one night, her voice thin as paper, and it half killed him that he never got to be right where anybody could see it. Then she looked at Della across the little lamp-lit room and said, "You got to be right where they can see it. That's the part he couldn't do." And Della understood that her great-aunt had watched the whole thing coming from the start, had seen it the evening the trailer backed up to the barn, had known before Della did what the girl had bought for $2 and what she was going to be able to do with it that the old man never could. Verna Corwin died in March, at 88, in her own bed in the small house with Della beside her, quietly, the way she had done everything. And they buried her at the edge of the woods near the family stones, up the slope from where Alden lay, and it snowed the morning of the burial, a soft late-season snow that melted off by noon. Della sheared alone that spring for the first time, with no one at the near end of the property to walk up and stand at the fence, and she found the shearing had gotten easy, her hands sure now, the ewes calm under them, and the fleeces came off in the great soft weatherproof clouds she had learned to expect and had never once stopped marveling at. She wrote Verna's death in the notebook, the date, plainly, the way her grandfather had taught her to write the losses down so you'd learn something, though what there was to learn from losing the last person who'd known you, she could not have said. She kept the canvas coat and the rubber boots. She wore them to the barn that winter and every winter after, without any self-consciousness about it, because by then she'd earned the right. The turning of the men at the feed store did not come all at once, because that is not how those things go, but it came, and the first crack in it was Roy Tesler, which surprised no one more than Roy Tesler. It happened the third fall, when the county extension office, of all things, sent somebody out to the hollow to look at Della's flock, because word had traveled far enough that even the institutions had heard, and the man who came out took photographs and measurements of the fleece and sent samples off to a fiber lab at the state university. And the numbers that came back described a wool finer and more weather-resistant than anything the region was known to produce, and the extension office wrote it up, and the write-up got into the regional farm paper that every landowner in the valley read at his kitchen table. Roy read it. He read that the worthless rejects a girl had bought for $2 had turned out to be the last remnant of a breed the industrial market had wrongly discarded, and that the flock in Muldoon Hollow was now considered a source of some of the finest hand-spinning wool in that part of the country, and that buyers were on a waiting list, and that the young woman running it had done the whole thing without debt on ground everyone had said was fit only for cattle. Roy Tesler read all that at his kitchen table, and he did not say anything to anybody about it for a while. What he did, some weeks later, was drive up the hollow. It was a raw day in November, and Della was in the barn when she heard the truck on the gravel and came out to find Roy standing in the yard with his cap in his hands, which was not how she had ever seen him hold it, and he looked at the ewes in the near pasture for a long moment before he looked at her. He did not make a large production out of it. He said he'd been wrong about her sheep and about the ground and about her, and that he'd said some things at the feed store he'd take back if he could, and Della, who had learned patience from a woman who was weather and truth-telling from an old man's pencil, did not gloat and did not wave it off either. She just said, "Thank you, Roy," and let the silence do the rest. Then Roy said the thing he'd really driven up to say, which was that he had 40 acres of hill ground at the back of his place, steep stuff, no good for the cattle, that he'd let her run sheep on for next to nothing if she wanted the room. And Della looked at him a while in that way she had, and said she'd think on it, and she did think on it, for a season, before she took him up on it, because she still would not grow the flock one head faster than the grass and the buyers allowed, and Roy Tesler, to his credit, never pushed her, and the two of them became, in the strange arithmetic of that valley, something like partners, the largest landowner and the girl who'd paid $2 for 40 funerals. And no one at the feed store said the word hobby about the Corwin flock ever again. Word kept doing what word does, moving low and finding the far corners. And by the 4th year, Della was shipping wool to spinners in a dozen states and to 2 in other countries, and a small mill up north that specialized in the difficult fibers. The big mills wouldn't touch began buying her coarser clip to make a rugged, weatherproof outer yarn that a company in the mountains used for the kind of garments people trust their lives to in bad country. And still she grew the thing only the size the grass allowed. She hired the helper she'd needed for years, a quiet teenager from down the valley named Cy Renfrew, whose own family had lost their place and who took to the sheep the way Della had, patiently, watching before he acted, and she taught him the way Verna had taught her, in short pieces. And she gave him one of the notebooks to read and told him it was the whole of it. Everything she knew was in there, and in the pages her grandfather had written before her. And if he wanted to understand the flock, he should understand the winters, because the winter was where the worth was. Cy read the notebooks the way she'd hoped he would, slowly, and he stayed on. And in time, it would be Cy who carried the flock forward, though that was still years off, and is another story. The line that Della had heard in the auction shed, that a person could not build something out of nothing, that this led nowhere, she thought about it now and then, usually in the deep of winter, when she was out among the Ewes in the cold, with her hand pushed down through the icy outer coat into the warm, dry wool beneath. And she thought about how wrong it had been and how sure. She had not built something out of nothing. That was the part Roy had gotten backward, the part they all got backward. The worth had always been there, in the doubled fleece that looked like garbage from the outside, in the ground that grew hardy grass on a hill, in an old man's notebooks that nobody had bothered to read, in a breed the clever world had thrown away because its machines could not be troubled to handle a thing that shed the rain. The worth had been sitting in the back pen of that auction shed while 40 men decided it was worthless, and all Della had done, the only thing she'd done, was look at it long enough to see what was already there, and then work patiently, the slow way, the only way the hollow had, until reality itself proved the point that no argument ever could have. She had not made the wool valuable. She had let its worth be seen. On a clear, cold morning in the 6th winter, with the flock better than 300 head across her ground and Roy's back 40 and a rented stretch beyond, Della drove down to the county auction on an errand, and she found herself standing at the same back rail she'd stood at once with $2 in her hand, and there in the leftover pen at the end of the sale stood a lot of rough, matted, burr-tangled sheep of the double-coated blood, run down and half-starved, that some outfit up the valley had given up on, and the auctioneer was trying to move them for whatever he could get, and the men in the folding chairs were laughing the old laugh. Della looked at them a long time, the way she looked at things, and she crouched and put her fingers down into the filthy fleece past the dirt and the tangle to where the fiber lay close and fine against the skin, and she held it there a while, rubbing it slow between thumb and finger, and then she stood up and wiped her hand on the canvas coat that had been Verna's, and raised her hand, and she bought them, all of them, for a price that made the shed go quiet in a different way than it once had, because everybody there knew now who she was and what her hand on a fleece meant. She loaded them into her own stock trailer one careful head at a time, and she hauled them up the hollow to the clean end of the barn, And that night she sat at her grandfather's kitchen table with the notebook open, 3 volumes deep in 3 different hands now, and she wrote down the date and the count and the price, and beneath it, in the pencil she still preferred, she wrote her grandfather's old line the way she'd written it 100 times. The outside is the part that lies. And then she closed the book and went out to check the new sheep in the cold, where the winter was already beginning to do the only proving that had ever mattered. If this story reached something in you, do one thing before you go. Send it to somebody you know who's been told that what they have, or the work they love, or the thing they are, isn't worth the trouble, because somebody needs to hear tonight that worth doesn't disappear just because the clever people can't see it yet. Then tell me down in the comments about a time you saw value in something everyone else had written off, and how it turned out, because those are the stories I come here for. And let me know what town or what hollow or what stretch of road you're watching from tonight, near or far, because I read every last comment that comes in, all of them, and I like knowing where Della's ewes have wandered. The new sheep held the way she'd known they would, and 38 of the 40 pulled through the first hard weeks, which was a better ratio than the $2 lot had managed all those years before, because Della knew now what she hadn't known then, knew which ones were too far gone the moment she put her hand on them, and which ones only needed feed and time and a dry place out of the wind. She wormed them and trimmed their feet and fed them by hand out of a budget that no longer squeaked, and she wrote every ear tag number in the notebook, the losses too, because you write down the losses or you learn nothing, and she watched them come back to themselves through December and into January. Watched the fear go out of the way they moved when she came into the barn, watched their coughs ease and their eyes clear, and the doubled coat begin, under all that ruined filth, to lie fine and close against the skin, the way she'd felt it in the auction pen. Cy Renfrew worked beside her through it, and she saw him learn the thing she'd learned, that the recovery was not a rescue, but a read-in, that you were not saving a worthless sheep out of pity. You were uncovering a valuable one that had been let go to ruin by someone who judged it by the outside. Marisol Dung drove up the hollow in February, easing her car up the gravel the way she'd done for 6 years now, and she brought with her a woman Della had heard of but never met, an old spinner from the far end of the county named Odessa Pruitt, who was near 90 and had spun wool her whole life and who, it turned out, had known Alden Corwin. She'd bought fleece off him once, decades back, before the mill closed, and she remembered the double coat, remembered thinking it the finest thing she'd ever put on a wheel, and never understanding why he couldn't sell it, why the buyers wouldn't touch it, why a wool that good died with the man who kept it. She stood in the clean end of the barn with a fresh skirted fleece in her hands and worked the undercoat between her fingers the way Della had, the way Verna had, the way Alden must have, and her old eyes went wet and she said he was right then. All along he was right, and Della said yes, he was, and the two of them stood there a while in the cold barn, not saying anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying, and the silence held it better than words would have. That spring, Della did a thing she'd been turning over for a year, which was to take the last of her grandfather's notebooks, the private pages nobody but her and now Cy had ever read, and she copied them out clean, all of it, every scattered pencil remark about the fleece and the winters and the folly of judging a sheep by its outside, and she put the copies together with her own pages and Verna's few remembered lines, and she gave the whole of it to the extension office to keep, not for herself, but so the knowledge that had nearly died twice would not die a third time, so that the next person who found 40 ruined double-coated ewes in a back pen somewhere would have something written down to read. She did not make a ceremony of it. She drove the pages down and handed them over and drove home, and that was all. But the man at the extension office understood what he'd been given, and he kept it careful, and years later people would come and read it who never knew her name. The flock grew the size the grass allowed, and no bigger, always that, and Della never once borrowed against the ground, and by the time Cy Renfrew was grown and the natural inheritor of the whole quiet enterprise she had built, the Corwin wool was known in every place where people cared about such things, known by the name of a hollow that had gone silent and by the name of a girl who'd paid $2 for what everyone else called funerals. Roy Tesler grew old on his bottomland, and Della ran her sheep on his back 40 until he passed, and his sons, who had grown up hearing the story told against their father, kept the arrangement out of something like penance, and the sheep grazed the steep hill ground that had been called good for nothing, and shed the rain off their weatherproof coats and made a living off land the clever men had written off, exactly as an old man's pencil had promised they could. She was not young anymore the last time the story circles back to, and the hollow had come part way back to life around her. A few of the emptied farms bought up by makers and small graziers who'd been drawn by the wool and the quiet. And there was a Saturday market in Barrow Falls again, bigger than the old one, and the woolen trade in that end of the valley, small as it was real. And it had all pulled itself up out of one fleece a gas station clerk had rubbed between her fingers and said was soft as a rabbit. On a clear, cold morning, deep in a winter she'd lost count of, Della walked out into the near pasture in Verna's canvas coat, worn soft now and patched at the elbows, and she crouched among the ewes the way she always had, and she put her fingers down into the fleece of an old broad mother sheep, down past the coarse weatherproof outer coat that had beaded the frost and shed it, down to where the wool lay fine and dry and warm against the skin, and she held it there a while, rubbing it slow between thumb and finger, like a woman testing cloth she meant to buy a bolt of. The sheep chewed her cud and paid Della no mind. The winter did its slow proving all around them the way it had every year, the only argument that had ever mattered, and Della Corwin knelt in the cold with her hand full of warm wool and thought about a shed full of laughing men and 2 crumpled dollar bills smoothed flat against the wood, and about how the worth had been there the whole time, sitting in a back pen while everyone decided it was worthless, waiting for somebody to look at it long enough to see. That was all it had ever taken. Not money, not force, not scale. Just the patience to see what was already there, and the stubbornness to let the winters prove it, one cold year at a time, to anyone who cared to put their hand down through the outside, which lies into the truth beneath, which never had.